I hate anti-Semitism, but I'm strongly opposed to this kind of knee-jerk reflex anti-Semitism, which means that you can't criticize Jews. Because if you can't criticize Jews, then you can't look at the fact that the state of Israel is, after all, a state for the Jews. And the Jewish communities, certainly the American Jewish community, has become tremendously caught up in it. And I think, and of course this is not going to make me very popular, but I think that the American Jewish community has to realize what a tremendous and terrible thing it has done in supporting Israel, because I think of Israel as the last gasp of Western colonialism, settler colonialism, racism, and all the rest. And it's made possible and necessary even by the tremendous power of the American Jewish community, which has turned itself around 180 degrees, from being marginalized, has risen to power on the the wave of anti-Semitism, which means basically that you can't criticize, means you give impunity, means they can do anything they want, pretty much. I decided after a long time that I just could not be silent on the question of Zionism anymore. And so I started thinking it through. And the way I work is, I get interested in something and I study it, and by studying it I develop like a book about it. And but at first it wasn't a book, it was a couple of essays which I published in a national journal called Tikkun, which is left liberal. I don't agree with them in many ways, but they ran these articles. So like a few weeks after, like 3 weeks after I published the first of the articles, which was called Zionism's Bad Conscience, I was called into the president's office and told that my endowed chair had been taken from me. I was no longer the Alger professor. Why? Oh, the family wants to go in a different direction. And then he went on and say, but, nothing to do with your attack on Zionism. It's like, oh, right. Why bring it up? Who asked you? And then he went on again and said, and of course he denies completely that he ever said this. His name is Leon Botstein, well-known man. He always denies that, but my memory is excellent, and you're not going to forget something like this anyhow. So he said, nothing to do with your attack on Zionism. And he said, and of course, as you know, I'm an ardent Zionist. And he went on, and he started ranting and saying, I believe, Israel is a state, that the Jewish people need a state, just like the French people need France, the Jewish people need Israel. Which is, you think about it, is such an atrocious piece of reasoning.
You told me over the phone,
Yeah.
Before we get to the book itself, you told me your book had been banned. Could you discuss the
Right.
troubles you faced in overcoming Zionism, seeing, published, what have you?
Right. Well, I had a lot of trouble getting a publisher. In fact, eventually couldn't get a U.S. publisher, and worked with a British firm called Pluto Press, which has a very large collection of books that are either critical of Israel and or supportive of the Arab-Palestinian side. And they were distributed in the United States by University of Michigan Press, which is a very large firm, a huge university, as you well know. And when the book first came out in 2007, early, I got the expected impact, which was nil. I mean, nothing, I was able to speak here and there and get some radio interviews and the like, but dead silence, and the book was just didn't exist. And I don't mean in the New York Times or the mainstream. I mean even in publications on the left, you know, progressive publications like The Nation magazine. Doesn't, you know, didn't register on the screen. So I you know, plugged away and kept talking and made lecture tours, and there was a lot of solidarity groups, and had some rough times and good times. But then around June or July, I got a call from my publisher saying, wow, you know, Joel, somehow your book won't go away. People are kind of buying it, and it's a you know, it's an underground phenomenon. I had a lot of trouble finding a publisher in the U.S. for this book, and that's another story maybe take up later. But eventually I got a publisher in England, Pluto Press, which is well known for its books critical of Israel and Zionism and supportive of the Palestinians. And so they did it, but they had to have a distributor in the U.S., which was the University of Michigan Press, very large and, you know, progressive firm. In fact, they had even done a book on the one-state solution by a woman named Virginia Tilley, who was a friend of mine. It's called The One-State Solution. When the book was published early in 2007, this winter, nothing happened, basically. It was just ignored by the mainstream, ignored by the ordinary left liberal press, picked up on websites and you know, alternative media and the like. And I just, you know, plugged away, spoke here, spoke there, and just divided my time. And about June, I got a message from the publisher in England saying, Joel, it's remarkable. No, nobody's heard of your book. People are somehow buying it. The internet, you know, the internet and the underground networks or whatever. So the book wasn't dying. Let's put it that way. And I think I mention that because I'm pretty sure what that meant was that it triggered the next stage of resistance. You know, the first stage of the resistance to books like that is to just pretend they're not there and maybe they'll go away. And it was clear that this wasn't going to go away. So I soon started seeing broadsides on various types of web sites, and also hate mail arriving and regularly. And when I spoke, it would be kind of more active, you know, hostility in the audience. And then one day in early August, I got a phone call from the director of the University of Michigan Press, who said that, oh, there's trouble here. There's a group called the Stand With Us Michigan. And that's a phenomenon that's connected to the Campus Watch, you know, network itself. And it's part of this entity that I would call the Zionist thought police. You know what I mean? Just to sort of make sure that the world knows about attacks on Israel. And it was pretty florid. You know, this is a vicious, anti-Semitic, you know, rambling, incoherent, unscholarly book. You know, so animated by hatred of Israel and Judaism. And but it was directed to the press, the University of Michigan Press, to the U.S. distributor. And so the director, should I give his name? Yeah, his name is Philip Pacoda. I knew him from years before, actually. He was once an editor of a book of mine. He said, well, we're going to defend you because, you know, freedom of speech, and they can't get away with this. But I just wanted to let you know there's trouble. I said, great. And the next thing I know is nothing. And then somebody tells me, hey, Joel, your book is no longer on the website of the University of Michigan Press. I said, really? So I wrote him a letter, and he wrote back saying, well, you know, when I first said I'd support you, I hadn't really taken a close look at your book, and I don't think that's actually true. But I think he hadn't taken a close look at the attacks and felt the heat, because they were pretty severe. And then Dally went through the university channels as well. So I and some of our other people looked at the book, and we were just appalled. He used the word appalled at what we saw. You know, I thought this was free speech, but this is really hate speech, and I can't defend something that is hateful as this book and is motivated by just you know, viciousness. I forget the words to use. It's all it's on a website called codz.org, and so. this is an email, and he says, so we've removed your book from the list, summarily, this is suitable for the barricades, maybe, but not for a university press. There's no respect for the truth. Blah, blah. Well, I was shocked, but at the same time, I thought it sort of reminded me of this film I once saw about the Weavers, this left-wing music group. It's called Wasn't That a Time in the 80s. 82, the film came out, and Lee Hayes, who was one of the singers of the Weavers, was being interviewed there in the film. This is, a communist lefty guy, and he said, well, if it wasn't for the honor, I'd just as soon not have been blacklisted. And so once I recovered my shock, I said, well, I'd just as soon not have been banned, but it is an honor. It means they're really taking my book seriously. And, and I kind of expected that. And the book predicts that, not so much predicts, but it describes the extreme touchiness of Zionist criticism and the violence of their reaction.
Is this a form of McCarthyism in a sense? There are a number of people who have fallen Finkelstein.
Oh yeah, quite a few.
Could you discuss that in terms of what was?
Well, it's a little different from McCarthyism, in that McCarthyism is an initiative that sort of came from the state, from the Congress, from congressional committees. And this comes from what I guess you have to call civil society. I mean, organized citizen groups who make their voices known and putting pressure on another entity, in this case, a publisher, the distributor of a book. But the basic motive is, and the basic structure is the same. Is to suppress dissent, to say certain things off limit. And I most certainly no way expect everybody who reads my book to agree with it, maybe no more than 1%. But if I expected everybody to agree with it, I wouldn't bother writing. You know what I mean? I want to make a statement that runs against the compact body of organized belief, so if it creates furor, that's fine. But of course, this is beyond furor. This is actually removing it from the list, and I mean, it actually also was a serious breach of contract, and it could not stand. I mean, immediately, I have some fairly significant lawyers who are good friends and comrades and the like, and we immediately organized a committee, and the next thing it's a letter from the Center for Constitutional Rights, who are very close to the University of Michigan, saying, we just want you to know you're not going to, this will not stand, you can't do that. and of course you can't do that, and if the university had persisted, they would have been hit with a huge lawsuit, which they most certainly would have lost. So they didn't persist. They backed off. So the book was only literally banned for about a week. But when they backed off, they said, well, kind of grumbling, they said, well, we want to still get rid of this book, and because we find this book really very, very bad and very badly done, and doesn't meet the scholarly standards of the University of Michigan espouses and the like. And we're also going to take a look at the whole line of books that Pluto does. So actually what it meant was that my book, they couldn't touch that, but because of the contract with Pluto, which says they're obliged to publish what Pluto gives them. Rather, obliged to distribute it. Pluto publishes, they distribute it and sell it in the U.S. But what they could do is call into question the contract with Pluto itself, and that's what they set about doing. And it would take a long time to detail this. It went on for about another year, and the essence of it was that eventually they just pulled the chain on the Pluto contract when the time came up for renewal. It's renewed every year. So at the time of renewal, they just said, we're not going to renew it, and then there was an appeal, and they went back and forth. And so I felt sort of bad about that, because like to get rid of my book, I had to get rid of the whole Pluto line. On the other hand, the people at Pluto Press, publishers, were very forceful in, in supporting my rights and the rights of all the other published authors on this subject. And so they proceeded to get another distributor, which is Palgrave Macmillan. And it's interesting that they couldn't get a distributor at Pluto that was from a university press. And the universities are supposed to be, progressive and defenders of free speech and open debate. They could only get a distributor from a commercial house. And we've just treated the book as a commodity, and if it's legal, it's legal, and we'll make money from it. So that was, by the middle of '08, the book was finished with the University of Michigan Press. And it's interesting, the University of Michigan Press was finished too. This conflict really weakened it and shamed the university a lot, because it went on, and I know from inside information that the university got something like 650 letters in support of me and the book and attacking it. Considerable number of which were from alumni who said, I'm pulling my, donations, and I thought I'd send my daughter there, and forget it, and you can't do this sort of thing. This is a free country, and so it really hurt the university and hurt the university press.
How does the lobby exert such pressure? Do you have any details? What's your speculations? How on earth could they basically censor you?
Well, they do it by bludgeoning, by using heavy artillery, which they can disseminate through various channels. Their own press, the stories leaked or corroborated by the mainstream press. The way the lobby is organized, the Zionist lobby, is, I think, known to nobody, not even itself. But it's a loose organization of people who are bound together by a common set of beliefs. And the organization is coordinated through groups, particularly, the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, which is the centerpiece of it, but not so much for people like me, but rather for the government, politicians. And they put a huge amount of pressure, which we can maybe talk about later on. But there are other groups of the lobby that with the thought police, which I think is a useful term, that arise seemingly spontaneously. There's a group in Boston called CAMERA, it's committee, and it's an acronym for something about, again, to stop, hateful stuff on Israel. Or, of course, there's the Anti-Defamation League, which has a long and very complicated history in this. And it's a so and then there's the Association of major Jewish organizations. I mean, the Jewish community, both in America and around the world, is very highly organized, although not centrally organized. I mean, there's Jewish Fund, and the Council of Judaism, and this and that. I mean, and they're coordinated through groups such as like the Committee of the Directors of leading Jewish organizations. And then there are people like Daniel Pipes, who was the founder of the Campus Watch group. And his job is to be a cop against intellectual deviants like myself. And Stand With Us is a spin-off of that. So these are independent and semi-autonomous, but they're A, very, very much connected. They have a very common belief system. And B, it must be stated, money is no object. I mean, they're very well funded. There's no lack of financial support for this. And so they have staff. You know, there's the Zionist Organization of America, for instance, a similar sort of thing. If you look at their website, zoa.org or com, I forget which it is. And I once debated the director, a man named Morton Klein. Astounding stuff. I mean, on the website, they just simply boast on how, you know, and Morton Klein caused this guy to lose his job in the State Department because once, you know, he made a critical remark about the wall that Israel is building, and we can't have anybody like that. You know, it's like, wow, I thought this was a free country. But no, not with this subject is concerned. So there's a very, very high degree of like allergic response, you know, like if your body reacts to, you know, the immune system with antibodies to small amounts of foreign substances, and will have a major, you know, reaction, which sometimes, of course, can be deadly to the host. And I think that in part that's what's kind of happened is that these guys have clearly gone overboard, and they do it here and they do it there, and we organize, we being people like myself, with a common interest, not just being critical of Israel, but there's one common belief, which is that this country has a miserable level of debate on this subject, and so I speak a lot, you know, on this, and I say, you know, listen, I have extreme views. Fine, I can defend those views. Fine, I don't expect everybody to agree with these views, but I do expect everybody to agree with one common principle: we need a full and open debate on this subject. You know, from the time of Socrates, this has been the ruling principle of a civilized society. And insofar as a society forbids such a debate, and suppresses it and punishes people who are trying to advance unpopular views, and you know, and to do so through speech. I mean, you know, obviously, if I was going around, you know, being violent, that's another story. But all I'm doing is speaking. I'm using my voice. I'm using my mind. I have, you know, some skills, and I use them. I think everybody has to do what they can to advance the idea, the principles they believe in. I happen to have a certain gift for, you know, exposition and writing, and I can articulate well. So that's what I can do, and this is what I do. I do it entirely peacefully, but it is intolerable, and they have a tremendous clout, and I can't begin, I can only begin rather, to tell you that, you know, our society is permeated by these suppressive, you know, institutions and mechanisms that stifles adequate debate on this subject. And my principal goal is to fight against that and to bring that debate into the open. Because I do believe that if that debate gets into the open, the views that I'm advancing are going to win. I mean, maybe that makes me delusional, you know, but I can also defend that.
Is there a climate of fear and intimidation in academia and everywhere else? I mean, could you discuss that? Why everything is so squashed?
Oh, there's tremendous fear in academia. Tremendous. It's a very big subject. I mean, you have, you know, the main institutional bodies within civil society, the press, the visual media, you know, film industry. You have the churches, the religious institutions. Each of these is a battleground. And academia is second to none as such a battleground. In part because since the ostensible goal is open debate on things, it's more dangerous. I mean, and you should excuse the expression advanced society, cannot proceed except by having universities. And the very notion of a university means that propounding universal knowledge and universal principles of truthful inquiry. There's no university that can deny that except the extreme right wing, like Christian, Bob Jones University and stuff like that. And they're a problem in their own right, but this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about Columbia, we're talking about Yale, we're talking about Bard College, where I ended up. And where I was for a long time while I was writing these things, and wherever. The University of Michigan is one. You cannot have a university that just is closed as such, because it can't function at all. It has to have a certain space of inquiry. But on the other hand, it has to patrol that space. And that space is compromised, and there are, I mean, we could talk hours on it, because it has to do with not just overt principles, but ways of knowing things, ways in which knowledge is constructed, and principles of hierarchy and promotion. You know how hierarchical university positions are, and what gets a person tenure, which is to say security of employment and the like. All of these things are remarkably configured by the great struggles. And in the past, we had struggles about the left and communism and those things and socialism. But increasingly in the last 25 years, and this is, or really since 1967, more than that, over 40 years, there's been struggles over Zionism have been very hotly carried forth within academia.
Could you address
Yeah.
the idea again of the fear and intimidation factor? Could you narrow on that?
Sure. It's hard because nobody's going to stand up and say, I'm afraid. You have to know them. You have to know how, you have to see how they herd together and how unfree they are in their thinking, so to speak. And then you have to infer fear. And I mean, I can tell you that in my years at Bard, I was frequently upset and sometimes appalled at how fearful the faculty were, and how their positions were so timid, and how unwilling they would be to take open stances. And one way that was enforced was by, like tenure decisions. It didn't take too many of them. We have not enough time for me to detail any of this. But, like over the period of time I was there were about 4 or 5 very publicly contested tenure decisions on people who obviously should have been given tenure. I mean, they were just very superior on all accounts, and yet they were shot down at the very end by the president of the school, who took it upon himself to be the ultimate arbiter of that. So, in a sense, these are all like show trials, and.
Per Israel, you're talking about?
Well, no, these weren't. Well, one of them was a guy who taught Islamic studies, which is, the other side of the same issue. And my goodness, he was not he was not at all, ardent anti-Zionist like myself. But he was, he was determined to give, the Islamic world a free and open hearing. And I mean, he was so good that his letters of support were, including, like the top professor at Princeton would say, Professor so-and-so is the best scholar of his generation, in the whole country. It's like, wow, this is like, the senior person in Islamic studies. So, and everybody loved him, and he was amazing in all respects, and then cut down, and that's what happens in academia. You have these little sort of backbiting hierarchies. Anybody who's worked in the academic field will, with a halfway honest mind and open eye, will pick this up. And again, in Bard's case, it was the president who really should keep his nose out of tenure decisions, right? But they didn't. He would just said, "This is my way of exercising legitimate authority." No, very few polished presidents do this, but he did it. And he said, "Well, I know Professor B had good records and so on, recommendations. But I take the really big picture, and I look 20 years in the future. Do we want a man like this? And then, then if you look more closely, you can see that there are these other wars within academia. The professor of religion, who was an ardent Zionist, who played a role later on in getting me sacked from the school when my turn came, so to speak. I presume you're going to talk about that. Had it in for this young man, and so it is. In other words, but these are show trials, and everybody at a school sort of knows about it, and they draw the proper conclusion.
Could you? That's a good segue to your own.
Yeah.
Did you lose your teaching job in some context?
Yes, I did, but it was a little more disguised. It wasn't. It was more complex than what I just mentioned. First of all, I was never on tenure track. I had contracts, and they were handled through the president's office, and they were handled around the provision of an endowed chair to me. So I wasn't a regular scholar because my background was, it was authentic and good, but it was unusual. I was a physician and a psychiatrist. I was a professor of psychiatry and, had a high position in the medical field, so MD, so went to the best schools and so on. But I had a career change, and they hired me as on this endowed chair, which was actually named after Alger, the great, left-wing State Department official who eventually was brought down as one of the first of the McCarthy era, in some ways the most significant. That's a long story, and we can go into detail if you like. But in any event, I was given the Alger chair. So, in part because I was just very much on the left at that point. I'd actually been forced out of my job at the medical school because I was so much on the left. And why I'm on the left, I don't know. I developed a certain way, and that's the way I am. I was on the left, but and when I was hired, not specifically on the Palestine-Israel question, but just imperialism and eventually, I developed this major interest in ecology and capitalism, and I wrote a book called The Enemy of Nature, which was also published in England, and that book didn't get banned or anything, but it was very controversial because the subtitle of the book was The End of Capitalism or the End of the World. The idea of the book was that capitalism was just destroying the planet, which now I think increasing numbers of people are quite aware of. There's no question about it, really, unfortunately. When I published that, after I published that book, I started becoming sort of unpopular on campus. For instance, they have an environmental studies program in a small school, and nobody ever invited me to meet with the students at all. Because the environmental studies program is just to develop administrators, people who can work within the bureaucracies of the existing system, not people who call the existing system into such question. So I could see the wind blowing against me, and there are other instances of this not being ever asked to speak on campus functions and the like. Although I had very good teaching experiences, and I had a devoted following of students. But then around the early years of this millennium, I decided after a long time that I just could not be silent on the question of Zionism anymore. And so I started thinking it through. And the way I work is, I get interested in something and I study it, and by studying it I develop like a book about it. And but at first it wasn't a book, it was a couple of essays which I published in a national journal called Tikkun, which is left liberal. I don't agree with them in many ways, but they ran these articles. So like a few weeks after, like 3 weeks after I published the first of the articles, which was called Zionism's Bad Conscience, I was called into the president's office and told that my endowed chair had been taken from me. Yeah, I was no longer the Alger's professor. Why? Oh, the family wants to go in a different direction. And then he went on and say, but, nothing to do with your attack on Zionism. It's like, oh, right. Why bring it up? Who asked you? And then he went on again and said, and of course he denies completely that he ever said this. His name is Leon Botsky, well-known man. He always denies that, but my memory is excellent, and you're not going to forget something like this anyhow. So he said, nothing to do with your attack on Zionism. And he said, and of course, as you know, I'm an ardent Zionist. And he went on, and he started ranting and saying, I believe, Israel is a state, that the Jewish people need a state, just like the French people need France, the Jewish people need Israel. Which is, you think about it, is such an atrocious piece of reasoning. I mean, what do you mean the French people need France? The French people live in France and live there for 10,000 years, and they develop a society. The Jewish people live everywhere, including in France, and then they, for reasons that demand explanation, they went and decided to expropriate the population in the Eastern Mediterranean. In any event, a Jew can become a Frenchman, but a Frenchman can't become a Jew unless he makes an existential shift. He can't make that comparison. But he made it in a very breezy way. So I wasn't going to argue with him at that point. I just, it was the end of that. But it was the beginning of a bunch of estrangements. Because then, they're not going to stop me. So I went and published the next of my articles, which was actually even more radical and called for the one-state solution. I said, I don't think the state of Israel should stand. I don't think it has legitimacy. And this is where people, push me. He's off the wall. He's off beyond the established debate. And but after I did that second article, I got called into the dean's office, and they thought, no, they didn't call it. It was a phone call. The dean said, well, Professor Kovel, we think maybe you should retire. We should consider retiring. No, I don't want to retire. So they worked out a half-time schedule to make me less prominent on campus. And I was happy in a way to do that because I was getting pretty sick of the place. It's a school that had a history of being sort of countercultural and sort of lefty and bold and brave, but I could see from the very beginning it was nothing of the sort. And a lot of that had to do with this plain old material interest. The school, unlike like a public university which gets state funds, or universities that have large endowments that can be put in safe securities, Bard is a college that is dependent on handouts from rich trustees who are pretty much all of them finance capitalists. They're Wall Street people. And they're financiers, and they pay for the school, And in fact, one of the people on the Bard Board of Trustees is a man named Martin Peretz, who's an ultra-Zionist, very, very repressive guy, published the New Republic magazine journal, and really wants to see me off the face of the earth, much less Bard.
Never heard from him.
Never directly, no. But it goes in, phone calls back and forth, and there's a long story here. Let me just give you a couple of other highlights, and then we can take it in another direction if you like. When my book Overcoming Zionism was banned, which it was in summer of '07, hundreds of letters, a lot of support, but guess what? Never the slightest support from the school at which I was teaching as a very senior, respected member of the faculty. And later I approached the president. He says, oh, we felt you could take care of yourself. You didn't need our help. which of course is absolutely irrelevant. In fact, I did take care of myself. But that's not the point. By not coming out and supporting me, they were tacitly and very strongly indicating that they supported the removal of my book. And never once has they actually committed themselves to saying this was wrong, that a book of this sort shouldn't be removed from publications and distribution and the like. Eventually, when the whole thing came out into the open, I was dismissed. They said, "Oh, Kovel, he wrote, he's written stuff, but it's not very interesting, and there's nothing original or particularly unusual about what he's done, And so therefore, that's not the reason we want him to go." Well, wait a second. If there's nothing unusual about my book, then why was it banned? How many books written by well-known academics get actually taken out of circulation? There must be something about that book. And of course, that's the way they reason. Eventually what happened is that when my next contract came up, they simply said, "You're not going to stay here anymore. We're finished with you." And they made up some story, and they trumped up an excuse that I was getting too old. My student evaluations had declined, which wasn't true. They made up that stuff. And they rode me out on very dubious grounds, violating the bylaws of the college by putting on a committee to evaluate me people who were ideologically very hostile to me, and so on and so on. And so we had a big fight about it, and eventually I left. But it was, by that time I didn't want to stay. I mean, I was totally sick of the place, and it was okay. I mean, it wasn't okay, but I had prepared for a long time for this to happen, and I'm doing quite well.
Okay. There are a lot of questions. I hope I can get to.
And no, I'm taking too long, perhaps, in answering these questions. Do you want me to try to be more succinct? I don't mind. It's not my style. My style is to try to speak in paragraphs rather than sentences.
Okay. What has been the response to your book, Overcoming Zionism, from the Jewish community? Anything?
Oh, sure, but it's not organized enough. Over the years, I get a lot of letters, and little reviews in this publication or that publication, some coverage in the Israeli press, very hostile. The Jerusalem Post, for instance. So it's a known quantity, but I get varied letters. Some extreme hate mail, not to the point of death threats or anything like that, but just scum of the earth, what are you doing, and but a considerable number of letters of a different sort from the Jewish community. And I think what I have done and sort of wanted to do and set out to do was to change the balance within the community, which I had to do by setting myself, against the compact body of opinion and taking a view, namely, that the state of Israel does not have legitimacy, and that the world would be better off if it did not exist in its Zionist form. That's what I say. I say it in many different ways, but that's the point. So, unlike many critics, I'm not just against the occupation. Although of course I'm against the occupation. I'm not against the human rights abuses. Of course I'm against the human rights. I'm not just against the Israeli attacks on Gaza and the like, or the building of the settlements and the war. I'm against all of that. But my point is to take a more fundamental position, which is that the notion of a Jewish democratic state is a contradiction in terms, and that's the source of the trouble. And if you don't like it, well, you should wonder why you don't like it.
Has the Jewish press paid any attention to you? Have you gotten any reviews or criticism?
Well, sometimes it's hard to. I mean, I have files. Mostly, them still. I mean, I'm known, that's for sure. But mostly, they don't. There's no symposia on me, this or that. My name comes up. But many of the letters that I get from individuals, some of them, well-positioned individuals, are letters that say, I read your book and it really made me think differently about this. And that's what I want, to make people think differently and to not just accept the views that are imposed by this very elaborate, powerful establishment. So I am very, very happy to have written this book and taken the stand I have, because although it is certain that I'm not the only person to have made a difference in this, I'm also certain that I have made a difference. There's enough people who have told me that. And many of them Jewish, many Jewish people.
One of the things in your book that was distinctive to me was you talk about Judaism, and you find links, classical, traditional, chosen people, all those kinds of ideas, nation apart, all that stuff, and you make connections between that and Zionism. Could you discuss that?
Sure. Although I'm sort of weighing, parenthetically, whether to do a second edition of Overcoming Zionism. The publisher wants me to do it. I might just do it. But even if I do it, I want to go further with that and actually write another whole book that follows on that question. And because I think it's deeply embedded, and it's something that has to be stated with extreme care and caution so that it doesn't slip into what's real, namely anti-Semitic kind of discourse. Anti-Semitic discourse would be that there's something inherent about the Jews that would force them to do this. Anytime, like any species of racism, anti-Semitism is essentialism. It says that like there's a Jewish essence, commercialism or cunning or conspiracy, whatever you want to call it. And it's the Jews doing this and doing that, and this is profoundly false. On the other hand, there are conjunctures, there are ways that history has created kinds of choices and modes of identifying yourself that enable certain configurations to take shape, which can be used in one direction or another. And as they get used, they have a further effect on the people who use them. That sounds pretty elaborate, but if you think about it, it's a way of putting it. So the Jewish people have certainly made very, very remarkable contributions to civilization, although it is not at all clear when this started or how much of it is mythical and the like. As you may know, I mean, the whole notion of the captivity in Egypt and the escape from Pharaoh, and that is unsupported by archaeological evidence, for instance. And a lot of people just think that, the first 5 books of the Bible were written hundreds of years later. The only time that you begin to get a identifiable Jewish community that's writing these things down and imposing is after the destruction of the first temple, which certainly existed, in Babylonian captivity, which existed, and then with the kingdom of Judea, where you had the scholars getting together and basically writing the Bible, and so the Old Testament, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and then there's the prophetic books and all the rest. Well, it was observed from the very beginning that the great thing that the Jews did, of course, was to develop a notion of a single God. And the point, however, is that the single God is sort of known as the God of a certain people, a set of people. The idea of nationality doesn't exist way back when, but the notion of a people of Israel, they say. And so the very contribution to civilization of the Jews was a product of this monotheistic impulse, but the monotheistic impulse also was tied to the notion of an exceptional community. And you had built into the very cultural DNA, if you like, which is not the same as regular, but a certain basic kind of structure that would either focus on the the fortunes of that community, or would focus on the universal aspects of the one God, who brings about, notions of justice and and obedience and the law, and all of which are incredibly important contributions to civilization. But mixed. I mean, nobody can read the Old Testament, particularly the first 5 books, without being struck by just how many extremely violent and murderous passages there are. How little there is of any kind of reflection about the ethical life of humanity. There's very little notion of the word love hardly ever appears. It's all about, command, and the Lord says you gotta do this, and if you don't do this, I'm gonna curse you, and and force you to do it. And it's a rough path, you know what I mean? And there's a lot of, and then heresies and exterminating the heretics and all of that kind of stuff with the golden calf, worshiping the golden calf and all that, and then they go and they kill. They said 3,000 Levites killed. Well, no, Levites killed 3,000 of their brothers and their fathers to support. So I mean, there's a lot of violence within that. In any event, it eventuates in a community that's where this nation, or pseudo nation or proto nation, is directed around the idea of a single deity who and imposes the identity through the law, through the lawfulness. You've got to do this, you've got to do that. It's the only, kosher, non-kosher, circumcision, all the things that constitute the law. And then the big destabilizing event occurs with the conquest of by the Romans, Roman Empire. So with that, the Jews had their own, I may oversimplify this. This is a book I'm going to write someday. They had their kingdom from the Maccabees, Hasmonean, and so on. But then they were taken over by Rome, and within the Roman Empire, they developed an actual semi-privileged position. It's interesting. Romans kind of respected them, and backed them, to King Herod, to build this big temple, and they had a high priest and all. But the Romans also did all kinds of terrible things to the ordinary people, particularly in the Galilee and the north. And that's where the Jewish movement associated with the figure of Jesus arises, which is the big turning point in civilization. But it also arose in such a way that it was a rupture with the Jewish people as they constituted. Many of them quite adapted to Roman rule, many privileges they had, and the like. And so a whole complicated set of things was induced at that point, where you had the Jewish people basically in one place, and then the Jesus movement, which was a Jewish movement, eventually moving out into the Gentile world. And the big point about the Jesus movement was that it said, listen, Judaism is stuck in the rigidity of its laws, and we have to make it open to. If we have one God, we should have the one God open to all humanity. And that's the big principle. Now, the one God could not be open to all humanity under the Jewish, lawfulness. And this is, a huge conflict within civilization.
May I interject?
Yeah, sure.
Because you're hitting the whole issue of universalism versus what many Jewish scholars call Jewish particularism. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of euphemism.
Another way of saying it, or exceptionalism, or
could you elaborate on that?
Yeah.
And especially in our society, there's a paradox, it seems to me, that in our universalistic, democratic, egalitarian society, the Jewish community has been in the vanguard for that over time, fighting for that. Yet when it comes to Israel, they're in direct opposite of that.
Yes, exactly.
Can you stress on that? Exactly.
Well, they'd have, first of all, Can I just finish the other line,
Sure.
and then I'll get into this one. I know this is, as I'm saying it, I'm thinking, this is too complicated. We're never going to be able to use this in this tape. I can see you're looking puzzled, and I'm not saying it as well as I could, perhaps.
No, it's not.
The main point, well, yeah, go ahead.
No, it doesn't matter. Go ahead.
No, the main point I want to make is that when this is, then two huge things take place. One is there's a rebellion against Rome by the Jews themselves, and the second temple is destroyed. And the Jews then become, just a wandering people. And the other is, of course, Christianity, after all of its tribulations, becomes the state religion of Rome. And so the valence between Christian and Jew is such that now the Jews are what's left over and what's from the past. And Christianity has its own universal pretensions, which are very complex, and they shouldn't just be oversimplified, But when it's tied to the fortunes of empire, which eventually it became, the Jews then become left on the side as a people whose only identity is with the God that they carried forth. And they went through many centuries until modernity and the Enlightenment on the periphery, outskirts. They became very important as middlemen, because they could help with the class structures of Europe, particularly, tax collectors and money lenders and merchants. And
were Jews forced into that, as is often said, forced?
Well, forced by lack of choice. I mean, if they couldn't be regular members of society and they couldn't hold land, which is generally speaking the case. Of course, there'd be Jews elsewhere in the world. We're talking now about within Europe. Then they had to make a living, and they had to make a living through commerce and their wits and using the money relation and so on, and being middlemen. And so they became this very complex intermediate structure inserted in the class relations between the barons and the aristocrats and the kings on the one side, and the peasantry and the masses, the people on the other. And this was offered some safety, but they were always dependent on the goodwill of the state, and the monstrosities of anti-Semitism arose out of that context, where the lower classes could blame the Jews rather than the people who the Jews were serving for their misfortunes. Places like Poland. Then along comes modernity and the Enlightenment, and you get a radical rethinking of everything. And now, all of a sudden, Jews can be, quote, emancipated, which is they can begin to assume normal functions in society and under certain conditions, which again are very complex. I mean, part of the problem here is this is such a complex, it's like the longest story there is. It goes back 3,000 years. It's played out across the whole globe, but certainly across all of Europe. And it has so many complications. It's very hard to have generalizations. But there's a big breakthrough, and the point is that comes the Enlightenment and the modern era. You have the Jews suddenly having the opportunity of using their marginality and their particularism in a way of breaking loose of the boundaries of thought. So you begin to get Jewish radicalism. You begin to get some section of Jews extremely radical. Of course, the most pronounced would be Karl Marx, who wasn't Jewish, but he was Jewish. His family comes from rabbis, and they had been made Lutheran, and they ran with it. But you can many scholars have looked at Marx, for instance, and you can see a very authentically Jewish thinker without using that category at all, but using the language of modernity.
He attacked the Jewish community, right?
What he attacked was in a very youthful essay called On the Jewish Question, He attacked the fact that the Jewish community had become identified with the money function, which he recognized as the oncoming capitalist power, which it is, commodification and value and all those things. And he said that the solution to the Jewish question is to transform our relationship to money, because as it is, the Jews are caught up in that relationship. Now, he was talking about not the small fraction of Jewish radicals, but about a considerable mass of Jewish middlemen who were merchants and bankers and money usurers, money lenders, tax collectors, and so on. People who handled money. And he felt that that was deadly for the Jews, and that you shouldn't just, you can't emancipate, and somehow money became Judaism. Money and Judaism became identified. So he said in that famous essay, the emancipation of the Jews will take place when society is emancipated from Judaism, which is the money function. When we overcome our dependence on money, in which the Jews are trapped. Okay, and of course he got excoriated for that. But I think if you look closely, there's a profound truth in that. And
he's been accused of being anti-Semitic.
Well, but I don't think he was.
Have you been accused of being anti-Semitic?
Of course.
Did you discuss that?
Well, of course. I'm not anti-Semitic, but I'm anti-Semitic. You know what that means? I mean, I know I'm not anti-Semitic, okay, because I know anti-Semitism when I see it, and it makes me really mad. Like I was reading about this guy Weinstein, who's a soldier, a Jewish soldier in the army, which of course I don't like. I don't like the army, but he did his job, and he has to deal with these Christian nutcases who want the U.S. military to be Christianized and violently anti-Semitic. And he's fighting them, and I really respect this guy. I know that, okay. And all these Christian Zionists are tremendously anti-Semitic, and so I can recognize that, and believe me, I've studied the Holocaust, I've studied Nazism. My blood still boils when I read about that.
So what do you mean by anti?
Yeah, that's right. But I think there's been a terrible thing that's happened to our society in that, because of the extremity of the Holocaust and the fact that Christian society, including the United States, had treated the Jews so badly for so many centuries, that there was this reaction, turned it on its head. So instead of anti-Semitism, you had anti-anti-Semitism, which then comes philo-Semitism, which then comes, the Jews can do anything they want and you can never criticize them. Because if you criticize them, then we're violating, the law. Then we're going back to the way we were for so many centuries, when we had pogroms, when we had made them move here and there, we put them in ghettos and treated them so shabbily. This is just a logical inversion, without, however, escaping the trap in which the Jews were caught, and in which Marx, I think, correctly identified. So I hate anti-Semitism, but I'm strongly opposed to this kind of knee-jerk reflex anti-Semitism, which means that you can't criticize Jews. Because if you can't criticize Jews, then you can't look at the fact that the state of Israel is, after all, a state for the Jews. And the Jewish communities, certainly the American Jewish community, has become tremendously caught up in it. And I think, and of course this is not will make me very popular, but I think that the American Jewish community has to realize what a tremendous and terrible thing it has done in supporting Israel, because I think of Israel as the last gasp of Western colonialism, settler colonialism, racism, and all the rest. And it's made possible and necessary even by the tremendous power of the American Jewish community, which has turned itself around 180 degrees, from being marginalized, has risen to power on the the wave of anti-Semitism, which means basically that you can't criticize, means you give impunity, means you can do anything they want, pretty much. And that's what's really happened. And this comes also out of my very personal experiences, because I can see my family, when I grew up, well, there was conflict, but the main part of my family, particularly my mother, was doing all kinds of things to support the founding of the State of Israel. And when I point out that, I said, "Gee, Mom, but what about Palestinians?" And she said, "Oh, they're violent." I said, "Well, like 100 Palestinians are killed for every Jew that gets killed." She says, "Good, that's the way it should be." I said, "No, what are you talking about? It's awful." But meantime, plant trees there and get bonds and bonds in my name and in the name of my children. It was a big struggle for me. And so that's anti-Semitism. And I'm against anti-Semitism, which is to say I want us to open up the discourse, and everybody should be fully responsible for what they do in history. And the Jewish people, in my view, have to redeem themselves and can redeem themselves. But to do so, they have to recognize that they went astray in the State of Israel, where the State of Israel is concerned. And you can't blame that on the Holocaust. Why? Because the logic of the State of Israel was fully worked out, before there was a Nazi movement. It was worked out in the 1890s. Herzl and all those people. It was one particular offshoot of the emancipated, Jews, many of whom have become communists, socialists, and, Bundists and the like, labor leaders, and many of whom had moved off and become shopkeepers and moved to the United States, like my family, and just had a decent life. But some of these ideologues, who actually they pretended to be left-wing, but they really were right-wing. And you look and see what they were planning. They were planning to expropriate the indigenous people, which is what they've done.
Jabotinsky or Jabotinsky?
Yeah, sure.
What do you
I don't know.
Synopsize him?
Well, Jabotinsky was actually a precursor of the Israeli right wing, and he was a Russian journalist a Zionist, who basically said that he thought that the main body of the Zionist movement, which we might call labor Zionism, which was a way in which the Jews could sort of think they could have their cake and eat it too. Namely, and this gets back to what you asked me a while ago about, are they how do you explain the fact that they do so many things that are kind of right-wing and punitive and this and that and greedy and expropriatory, ethnic cleansing, at the same time also support all of these universal doctrines? Well, that's the effort to synthesize within Zionism the Zionist principle with the universals that come from the finer moments of the Judaic tradition, coming from the God of justice and the like. But it's false, because it never freed itself from the primary motive, which is to take over the land of Palestine for the Jews. And it was very hypocritical. It was full hypocrisy, even though some of them were Marxists and many of them were socialists, and they had the Histadrut, which is the labor federation. So they actually had the economy of the Jewish community, Palestine was directed by ostensible socialists, the labor leaders, although it wasn't that simple either. Anyhow, Jabotinsky came along and said, look, you guys are just caught up in hypocrisy. You're trying to deny what you really want to do. And I think you should be honest about what you really want to do, which is you've got to use force. And you can use force, but if you use force and are tough with the Palestinians, you can subjugate them and still get what you want. And you shouldn't try to pretend to be socialists, because you're not.
Some have called him a fascist.
Well, yeah, Mussolini called him a fascist. A lot of people call him a fascist. In fact, at one point he had his followers dressed up in brown shirts, believe it or not. And then somebody said that wasn't a very smart thing to do. He says, oh, maybe you're right. But he was also part of a spectrum of people who fundamentally broke with this labor Zionist, synthesis. That this is Zionism is a national liberation movement for the Jewish people, and it's connected to emancipatory goals. We just want to emancipate the Jews and all that. So Jabotinsky forcefully said no, but in doing so, he made an embrace with fascist elements, and two of his followers. Well, I can mention three of his followers. One was Menachem Begin, worshipped him, and, as you know, became Prime Minister of Israel. But also, during the rebellion period against Britain and the like, engineered the King David Hotel Terrorist Act, which was as bad as and worse, really, than anything that was ever done by the Palestinians. It was sheer terrorism, blowing up a hotel, and 88 people were killed in line, including Jews. Then the other would be Yitzhak Shamir, who's further to the right of Begin, and developed the Stern Gang, which actually, and he's also a follower of Jabotinsky, but further to the right, because Jabotinsky opened that choice so that you strip the colonizing Zionist impulse from its cocoon of liberal, humanitarian, socialist, higher ethical principles. And in doing that, you've actually released the demon. Okay? So Begin is one. Shamir to the right of Begin. Shamir, the Stern Gang, Stern was the director of the Stern Gang. He died, but Shamir followed him. And they actually made overtures to the fascists, the Third Reich. They said, we want to fight on your side against the British. And the Nazis wouldn't touch them because, are you kidding? But I mean, it's on the record. Okay. And eventually he becomes the Prime Minister of Israel. Okay. But I said there are three. The third one is a man named Maya Kahana, who, when he was a boy in Brooklyn, Jabotinsky used to visit their house. He worshipped Jabotinsky. And he became the most extreme. And in the 80s, while Shamir was the prime minister after Begin, Kahana had this party called Kach, which meant enough, it's it. Extreme, and which was frankly exterminist. And the Jewish Defense League, which, shot up some people here and there. And Israelis actually banned Kahana's party as a fascist party and a racist party.
Are you ever hassled with a JDL?
I haven't yet, no, and I hope I'm not.
Living here in New York, there must be a lot of...
There are many, and somehow I think, see, the problem is that it's not a problem, I think it's good. There's been a big shift over time. The whole thing is moving, it's tough, it's very, very conflict-filled. The biggest problem is institutional control of the U.S. government and the media and academia and the like.
By Zionism?
By Zionism, yeah, which is absolute.
This is a fine line here. This is where the Zionism infers for the most part Jews. So could you discuss that?
Well, first of all, it's not only Jews.
Okay.
It's not only Jews. neocons.
Well, could you discuss this fine line? I mean, this is a big issue in terms of anti-Semitism. Just criticize Jews, you discuss it. Or Zionists or the pro-Israel people. There's this very fine line, delicate, that people are. Could you discuss that?
Well, sure. I mean, it's indeed a fine line. But if you look, I just organize my thoughts for a second. If you look what's actually happening, okay. Let's just narrow it down to the most important thing, which is the state apparatus of the U.S. The national security state. Okay. National security state was originally founded in 1947. It comes out of the early Cold War, and has essentially zero Jewish input. In fact, in the early years, the State Department and the early CIA were strongly against the U.S. making any kind of alliance with Israel, because they said you were just asking for huge trouble. You're going to bring back. They used the word fanatics, and the Arabs are going to be totally intolerant of it. We're talking now about General George Marshall, Secretary, Forrestal, people like that. And Truman went ahead and did it because he was controlled politically by the Zionists. Okay. So, all right, fine line already. But now, within that arrangement, at the beginning, virtually no direct Jewish input or Zionist input. Because there were Jews in the New Deal, obviously, many, but there were Jews on the left. There were, a lot of them were, fellow travelers, or communists even, and they got purged during McCarthy period. People like Harry Magdoff, great man. We're not talking about that. We're talking about Jews who would work with Zionism and the U.S. security state. Big turn of events in the war. I mean, and then, for instance, Eisenhower totally opposed. Kicked him out of Sinai. He was the only U.S. president who could really stand up to these guys. It's amazing what he did. Kennedy hated them, but he couldn't really. He didn't have the clout of Eisenhower. But later on, Johnson comes along. Then you have the Six-Day War in '67, and the most remarkable thing happened. At the end of that, you had the state of Israel attacking the U.S. Liberty, the ship that was, about that? Right. Unbelievable. Just killed 34 sailors, wounded 170 others, almost sunk the vessel. Why? Because it was a surveillance ship, and they didn't want it to be seen what they were doing, probably to Egyptian prisoners of war, probably shooting them, murdering them. But I don't know. That's not really known. But what is known is that the U.S. actually didn't do anything about it. And Johnson said, "I don't see why we should embarrass our friend just because he sinks one of our boats." That's a quote. From that time forward, you had a big change. First of all, you had the American Jewish community starting to become much more proactive in its effect in relation to the U.S., and not just now supporting certain kinds of government officials, but actually making more pressure and inroads on the security apparatus itself. And the next big turn happened with Carter. The Jews and Zionists rather hated Carter because he imposed the Camp David Accords on them and made them give up the Sinai after the 7-Day War. Begin, who was prime minister, hated Carter, and he then made an alliance with Reagan and George Bush, H.W. Bush, who were running against Carter, to pull off this October surprise, with the deal with the Iranians, the hostages, and that wrecked Carter. And then Reagan came in, okay? And then you had the 80s. Now, at that point, from that point on, you began getting very, very active, now for the first time, active participation within the national security state of these people called neocons. Now, of course, there were others. You had Henry Kissinger, obviously Jewish, a major influence, but it was certainly not a neocon. He was a quote, realist foreign policy guy. Is that okay with the sound? Yeah. And Kissinger, was by no means, just one side of it. What you began to get with the Reagan administration, you started getting the infiltration of this neocon movement, some of whom were people who had been left-wingers, Trotskyites, who turned themselves around, like William Kristol. Some of whom were just very, very aggressive young men on the move, but the most interesting is the wrong word, like Elliot Abrams. You know Elliot Abrams. Elliot Abrams was one of the point men for the State Department and the National Security Council in the wars against the Sandinistas and the whole thing with Oliver North and that phase of imperialism. And you began to get others, and you began to get the next generation of American leadership, which was centered between Cheney and Rumsfeld, who eventually become the dominant figures in the second Bush administration. They start recruiting these people, like Wolfowitz, like Pearl, like Wormser, like Fife. I mean, you begin to get a large cadre of neocons, but not all the neocons were Jews. You got others who were, like John Bolton, and William Bennett, people like that. But take Bolton. The lingua franca, the common language of the neocons, was ardent U.S. imperialism, aggressive, preemptive imperialism, and Zionism. So whether they were Jewish or not, they had to be Zionists. Whether they were really Zionists or not, they had to act like Zionists. Michael Lind, who was one of them, wrote in his little memoir, he said that was the case. You couldn't not be a Zionist in the neocon worldview. So what you began to have now, notice the change over the years, you began to have the active movement of Jewish people, not all on the right. I mean, Wolfowitz is not a right-winger. Obviously, objectively he is, but I mean, subjectively he could talk a very progressive line. So now you can notice what I've gone on at some length here is just detailing a set of facts. Okay, a set of facts, say, includes having somebody like Elliot Abrams. Okay, Elliot Abrams is ardently Jewish, ardently neocon, with Leo Straussian and the whole notion about what goes into that bag, and also willing to engage in all kinds of criminal activity. He was actually convicted and then pardoned, and he surfaces again in the second Bush administration. How? He's now the director of Middle Eastern affairs for the National Security Council. So, is that anti-Semitic to say you've got an ardently right-wing neocon ultra-Zionist like Elliot Abrams running U.S. policy in the Middle East? Not just policy. For instance, when Hamas was elected, in 2006, and everything went nuts. What the U.S. did about Hamas at that point, they started a civil war. They started to arm, other elements of the Palestinian Authority against Hamas. But wait, I said they. They didn't. They, abstract pronoun, could be anybody. Could be Abraham Lincoln, and no, it was Elliot Abrams who did that. So I mean, now you have a guy like Elliot Abrams who's actually running a civil war in arming, the Palestinian Quisling faction, which is part of their imperial strategy against Hamas. So where's the anti-Semitism?
What about those who charge, if you start naming individuals to be Jewish, that's anti-Semitic? What's your take on that?
Well, that's my take on that is that that's anti-Semitism, and I'm anti-Semitism.
Let me ask you this.
Anti-Semitism.
I've heard an argument that argues
they are. They're there. All these guys are Jewish. Or there are people like John Bolton, who, or others who are Christian Zionists, you know, and there's a convergence there, very important conversion. Okay, I'm sorry.
There's an argument I've heard that the organized Jewish community is almost entirely pro-Israel. Right? I mean, from the synagogue on down, and individuals like yourself, born Jewish. I mean, when in terms of you've made it clear the idea of anti-Semitism is some kind of Jewish essence. Are we talking about an ideology that I mean, you were born Jewish, but you're not part of the Zionist lobby? But so where would you draw the line? Who in the Jewish community are the ideological enemies? I mean, not to say all Jews don't fit. What are we talking about?
Well,
organized?
Actually, the majority of Jews are not ardent Zionists. I mean, by estimates, and it's really difficult to pin this down, but, you know, I think the best estimates would be about 10, 15%. And there are many Jews in the middle, and there are a certain number of Jews now who are becoming actively anti-Zionist. As for me, I can explain it very directly, because when I was a boy, I just, for family reasons, I write this in the book. If you remember, I had this aunt whom I loved very much, who was a free spirit and religious and all that. And then the other members of the family attacked her at her funeral, and a lot of my life was determined at that moment, because I said at that moment, I don't want anything to do with this community, because of the way, you know, the spirit of my dead aunt was introduced by the other relatives, other aunts of mine, you know. And I thought that was disgusting. Still do. They're all dead now, so I can talk about it. And that, I think, freed me. That also in the fact that my father, who was actually a very, very troubled man, but an ardent right-winger, was anti-Israel. So I knew there was a space to argue about it within my family.
May I ask you wrote about a teacher you had at your Hebrew school, and you said his words were positively spat out, bearing hatred for the who had persecuted our superior people. You talk about my quarrel with my Judaism took shape about the themes of chauvinism and entitlement. To a particular group chosen status is nonsense. Could you discuss that?
Well, I mean, this was before the crisis that I mentioned about my aunt and all that, which took place when I was about 17. This is when I started studying in Hebrew school. And my memory isn't 100% on this. I don't know whether he wasn't a teacher at Hebrew school. I don't know whether I saw him before I went to Hebrew school or because I wasn't doing very well at Hebrew school. Now, I'm a bright guy, and I was doing very well at school. But I really wasn't doing very well at Hebrew school, because I really didn't. So before anything else, I wasn't taken with it. I don't know quite why. Speculate, but that's true. But so in any event, my parents took me to see this guy, who was an Orthodox, like a tutor of some sort. Because I think it was because I wasn't doing well at Hebrew school. But in any event, I remember very much seeing this guy. And I mean, he's a bright young Jewish boy. He wants to take him in, and I mean, obviously had an interest in. So he lays this line on me, and it, first of all, I didn't like just the look of him and the way he was sitting there, and his family, and the wife in the background, and it repelled me with my incipient kind of left-wing feminist position. But when he got started, I mean, the guy was so convulsed with hatred about, the Goyim, the deep rage, which I can understand in retrospect. It sort of runs like a subterranean stream throughout Jewish communities in the Western world, and is not justifiable, but understandable on the basis of centuries of. Even if you weren't persecuted, you were acutely aware that you didn't belong, that you're not considered full citizens and the like, and lots of people don't like you. So you develop solidarity, and you look after your own, you develop mental habits of quickness and you work with your own kind, and you work very hard, and you play by the rules, but you do it to sort of subvert the existing powers. And that accounts for a significant subset of the Jewish community, and include of the Orthodox especially. And this guy was one of them. But what I couldn't stand about him was the violence of his views, which just didn't make any sense to me. I mean, he was talking about Christ, Jesus Christ, and the hatred he had. No, I didn't know anything about Jesus Christ. I mean, his name, but I didn't know from what. But what does he hate him so much? And why did he hate him? He hated him because the guy was, his parents weren't married to each other, because he was a bastard. He said, "Whoa, come on, give me a break." So what? I mean, I've learned subsequently that they didn't really have, marriage bureaus and licenses back then. You know what I mean? People got married when they made a commitment to each other. That was being married. And sometimes your father would choose it and this and that. But, I mean, the guy was awful. And I basically told my mom I never want to see him again. And that played a role, of course.
Well,
I didn't like people like that.
Is there racism in the Jewish traditions?
Oh, of course.
You discuss that?
But racism is a very hard word to understand. It's a subject that's always fascinated me, to the extent that my first book I wrote was called White Racism. It was white over black, and I became very interested in that. And that book was quite well received. Got it nominated for a National Book Award, for instance. But so I pondered racism, hierarchies within society, in which over and under was correlated with being more and less human. So the fully developed human being would be the beneficiary of racism, and the derogated or rejected human being would be the object of racism. So obviously applies to the blacks, and applied to the Jews vis-a-vis the mainstream Christendom, where they were considered devils, and Christ killer, and the Christ killer stuff. Not that everybody believed it, but it was a belief that had legitimacy, and you could believe it. It was there to be believed, or that the ritual murder of babies and this crazy stuff, which was probably a symbolic transposition of the fact that Jews were tax collectors and taking money from for the benefit of the wealthier classes. So the Jews are certainly the objects of racism. I mean, just like blacks are the objects of racism. But the object of racism can become the subject of a counter-racism, in which he or she can project hatred towards members of the superior group, but not the upper class members, but the commoners. It's a little like what just happened. I mean, you're seeing me. What is today? The 21st of July. There's this story about Sherrod, this woman who the Fox News doctored the video, and they say, "Oh, here's a black woman who's racist against whites," which, of course, she wasn't. I mean, she wanted to get rid of white farmers, but of course, she actually wanted to help the white farmers. Little matters like that. But it shows you how it's constructed. Like myth. Well, there are definitely black people who have constructed, views about like white devils and you take a very important person like Malcolm X. What you see, for instance, Malcolm went through this complex evolution where he was he was a street hustler and a criminal, and then he became a Muslim, a black Muslim, and in that position, he developed kinds of categorizations of whites, white devils, this and that, the other, that, and so he was. You can say he passed through a black racist period, but then he became a universal he realized that Islam had a universal meaning. And at that point, he saw through it all, at which point he was murdered, all of which is a terribly important series of judgments. Now, the point I want to make is there is this counter-racism on the part of the oppressed classes. And it's counter-racism, but you have to put the counterpart in, It's not real racism. It's a reaction to real racism. It's a defensive reaction. And you saw that amongst the Jews informally when the Jewish people were, despised and outcast and lived in these little ghettos. They developed a lot of hatred towards the, Christians. And we used to have this like funny little trope, Goyim, Tui, you would spit, say Goyim, Patui, you would express your hatred of the Goyim. Well, that's not nice, it's not right, but it's a counter-racism, okay, at that point. And it consoles you, it gives you something else to hate so you can hold yourself together, project out the bad feeling onto the other. But I want to emphasize very, very strongly, it forms maybe an enabling condition, but it is by no means identical with the profound racism within Israel and within the Zionist community. Because that's not a counter-racism, that's another racism, because like the white over black racism, it comes from within the power structure. It's a way of rationalizing things. In terms of the white power structure, they developed this white racism in many ways. It comes, but the simple point, not a simple point, a way of looking at it, simply oversimplifying but getting at the heart of it, is to say that this country was founded with high ideals, with the notion that democracy. You look at the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, blah blah blah, and everybody, it's beautiful. All men are created, and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Great stuff. But what are you going to do about the fact that a third of the population was black chattel slaves who were commodities, and the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence owned about 50 of them, however many Jefferson owned. Well, how they were going to do it by when they had to develop a means of representation in the Constitution. And they said, for the purposes of representation in elections, we will count slaves as 3/5 of a person. And that kind of puts it right to the heart of it. It's like, all men are created equal, but, or let's say all humans are created equal, but they're not human. They're only 3/5 of a human. And it's the same thing with the Zionist motion, and which I saw very, very abundantly in my family. There's just vicious racists within my family, and these were now not Jews who were being oppressed, because they were mainly racist against blacks who were lower down on the scale. I'm just talking about family members. I can remember evening gatherings, and they would start talking about the niggers, the jigaboos, and and I had an uncle who, his own brother was a cop, Jewish, and he used to come home and boast about how he would beat up the black bastards. He was a cop. Like, that was the thing New York City police would do. Hey, how many niggers did you kick the shit out of today? That sort of thing. Now that's racism. That's like transition. That's the Jewish now identifying with the dominant, white power. But when they become in charge of Israel, when that Zionist entity, then you get the equality which I develop in my book. I think it's a very important idea of bad conscience, because they do so with this kind of with the labor Zionist impulse, that this is national liberation movement, we're freeing the Jews, we're doing this for universal principles, we're doing it for socialism, and so on and so forth. Of course, we have to get rid of the indigenous people. Well, what are you going to do? You can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. So first you start off with the rationalizations, but soon enough, you come up against this problem. But wait a second, as Jews, we were taught, weren't we, that we are very ethically developed people. And I guarantee you that was laid down to me as a child. That you are a member of a people that goes back to Abraham and patriarchs, who has a higher ethical position in the world. And you're, and that's your greatness, is your ethical. So now, this is much more developed. This is not my uncle's brother, who's a Jewish cop, who's beating the crap out of a black just because he wants to identify with the white power structure. This is now the emancipator of Palestine, the Ben-Gurions and the like. Not the Jabotinsky, those people were kind of free of that. But the ones who had the higher ideals, those are the worst racists. So in order to, to deal with those ideals, they have to say that the people they're conquering are not really people.
Can I ask you now,
they're lower than humans.
This universalism versus Jewish particularism, the fact that Jews are so active in civil rights and all that, but when they come to Israel, they have a blind spot.
Yeah, sure.
Could you address that?
Well, it's more than a blind spot. It's where the truth hits them in the face. It's the light is blinding. And as you know, I mean, it's quite possible to go through all sorts of motions and salve your conscience with charity, handouts, voting for a decent politician, signing a petition, doing a little charity work, helping the disadvantaged and the like. These are standard ways. And were American Jews guilty of bad faith in doing this? No, I don't think so. Although some were undoubtedly. Just that's the way people are. I mean, a lot of them were really very serious on this subject. And there's organizations now, one called Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, JFREG. I don't know if you know this organization. I mean, their big movement is to help help the domestic staffs who are almost always Latino women and some black women who walk the kids in Central Park and and clean the houses of the Fifth Avenue and so they want to help them economically, but you would never. What they won't do is discuss the question of Israel. They won't do that.
So this is, as a psychiatrist, psychologist, whatever your background is, what's social psychology, in your view, of this paradox? On one hand, bending over backwards to help the oppressed here. Yeah. On the other hand, bending over backwards in the other direction. Well, what's going on? It's not
a very difficult thing to account for. This is not rocket science, even the psychological rocket science. I mean, it's that at some level, it is known that Zionism, to create the state of Israel, had to commit terrible crimes, and that its history is stained with blood. And so that has to be countered with good works, among other things. And you can show the world that you're a good person. I mean, there's a deep, unresolved guilt feeling that is basically kept out of awareness entirely by, being a progressive, taking the side of the underdogs and so forth. But then there's a little aphorism, PEP, PEPs, progressive except was Palestine. Because to help the black maid or the nanny is a free ride, and it builds you up certain points in the court of the mind, so to speak, and in the community, and you're looked at as beneficent. But to look at the actual object of the crime, the people who have been displaced, who are still the objects of ethnic cleansing, who are just being shot at every day. I read a lot, the woman in Gaza goes to get her 2-year-old who's wandered into the zone. Bang, shoot her, kill her. Just went after her 2-year-old, Poor woman, what was she doing? She was taking care of her baby. That sort of thing, that kind of deep, unreconstructible criminality. The only way to deal with it is to simply abandon Zionism, overcome Zionism. And that means do not maintain this cruel, inhuman, life-destroying state structure where you have to have a state for the Jews.
I'm going to hit you with some quotes from your book, please. Okay?
Sure.
I don't know if you recall this, so I'm taking it out of context when it's tossing it. So I'd like to see where you go with it if you recall. You
want me to just comment on it?
Yeah. This is just a comment on your book.
Yeah. You want me to comment on it?
Please.
Sure.
Elaborate, please.
Yeah, sure.
So you say the Zionism that insists that the only true way of being Jewish is loyalty to the state of Israel is also a kind of anti-Semite. You remember talking about that?
Yeah.
Did you discuss that?
Yeah.
Why? How?
Well, because anytime you say only, you're essentializing. You're saying this is the only truth that you can speak about the Jew in this question. So you're reducing the Jewish person to, what could be a set of beliefs, but is not the core of his or her humanity. The core of his or her humanity is to be a freely constituted person who's capable of transforming the self. So to say that the Jews are locked into the only way, which is it's another way of saying they're locked into it, is to sell them short. Is to say a Jewish person does not have the capacity of a human being, which is to change. So, and just to add on to it, and to understand from reality, to learn from reality. Listen, State of Israel has now, checked in 62 years. It's not forever, but it's a long time. There's a real track record there. It's enough time to say, hey, we made a big mistake. We've got to do something different.
Can I ask you,
Sure.
I've heard this term a million times, and you have the self-hating Jew.
Yeah.
You must have been called that. It's a form, as I understand it, it's a form of anti-Semitism from within the Jewish community. Yeah. But could you elaborate on...
Well, first of all, do I look like a self-hating person? No.
No, you're a nice guy.
No, I'm not sure I'm a nice guy, but I'm not a self-hating Jew.
And how this works, mechanism, whatever.
Look, one is entitled to reject Judaism if you think it's the wrong way to go, and one is obliged, in my view, to hate injustice. One should not be trapped in it. I think when you say you're a self-hating Jew, that says you're trapped in it, you sit around brooding about it. No, I don't say that at all. I say that I'm someone who was born Jewish. I can sit here for another hour and tell you great things that were done within the Jewish tradition. But from the end of the 19th century, they embarked upon a path that has been catastrophic, and that should be opposed. If you want to call that hating, fine. Sometimes I hate. I can't tell you. And this is a lot of people who are in this struggle with me. We talk about this amongst ourselves. How when you watch a guy like Netanyahu, so dripping with hypocrisy and cruelty, and things like that, to be truthful, you feel hate in your heart against them. And then you have to say, well, I have to overcome that. You know, I have to overcome that too. But there's something there to overcome. But you don't overcome it by then turning it on yourself. You don't become a self-hating Jew.
Can I ask you to
oh, yeah, sure.
Adjust that bit? So it's okay, but it'd be better if it's pointing up.
Oh, okay,
it's
sure.
Slipped a little bit.
Okay, sure.
You also say, quote,
yeah.
Tribalism is the curse of Judaism. It is an endless turning bound to the wheel of revenge. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, of course tribalism is a curse. I think it's, I mean, if you have no choice, you have to live as a tribe, but it's not a good way to live, particularly as you feel yourself set against everything else. You know, at some point when I was a child, a young man, they said, you know, it was like the test of everything is it good for the Jews? I thought, what is this crap? Is it good for, I mean, are the Jews supposed to be superior to all humanity? Is it good for the Jews? Is it good for the Jews to kill, you know, 10,000 or imprison 10,000 Palestinians? Build nuclear weapons? Is that good for the Jews? I mean, and in fact, if you impose that kind of statement, to me, you're losing credibility, so to speak. I don't want to be part of a people that regulates itself by saying, "Is it good for us? The hell with the rest of you." I don't feel that way. You know, I profoundly don't, and I feel that the Jewish people have to come to terms with that. That's the big barrier. And instead, the revenge part is they live off the crimes committed against them, or the anti-Semitism that is alleged to be their lot. You know, and so this is no way to be, and I utterly reject that.
Could you discuss Jewish history is just rife with an ideology of persecution, victimization, going even to the Old Testament, the Torah, correct? I mean, could you discuss that? How does that impact?
Well, I want to emphasize not all Jewish history, because if you say that, you're getting into an essentialization. I mean, there are Jews in many parts of the world that didn't feel that way from, and even, I mean, like for the first millennium, even the Jews weren't doing that great. I mean, that's 1,000 years. It's like, you know, it's only another 1,000 years after that, half the way. Jews didn't have grounds for that. The serious, you know, persecution started in the early, you know, medieval period. The Jews were butchered in 70 and 135 Common Era, but not all Jews. Those are the zealots who, you know, rebelled against Rome, and they certainly were not the only people who caught it from the Romans. You know what I mean? You know, the people who committed suicide by jumping off the cliff at Masada, it turns out, weren't trying to escape the Romans. They were trying to escape other Jews. They were criminals. It's interesting. So, I mean, it doesn't really, first of all, it's not empirically true. Second of all, even in all of the centuries that between 1000 and, you know, 1933, whatever you want to, the Jews didn't always have it bad, by no means. There were a lot of times they had it bad, but they didn't always have it bad. You know, millions and millions of Jews grew up, had reasonably happy lives, you know, had their families, and they weren't being persecuted all that. But there were episodes of persecution, and there was this aura that you're living in this Christian society that you know, its own bad conscience is played out against you. That's terrible. But I mean, there were Jews in Goa, you know, in India, in what's now Kerala in India. These people never felt that way. They practiced their Judaism. So let's be very careful about that. It's particularly though, once the Jews embarked on the Zion, or to the extent that certain Jews, let me put it better, to the extent that certain Jews embarked upon a Zionist path, then they were caught up in this criminal activity that involved expropriating indigenous people and getting rid of them, which violated not just universal morality, but their own special sense of ethical superiority. Okay, and the only way they could deal with it, well, there was there were several ways. One way was through racism. The people that were expropriating are no good, they're evil, blah, blah, blah. They're stupid, not civilized, or don't exist, the Golda Meir thing. Or to call attention to the greater crimes being committed against you. Look how we've suffered, oh my God, look what you've done to me, oh my, I'll never forgive you for making me kill you, that sort of thing. Oh, and this kind of weepy, lachrymose, it's a quote from Salo Baron, a Jewish historian, that there's a lachrymose interpretation, tear-saturated interpretation of Jewish history. No, not true. Probably over the historical time, majority of Jews lived pretty decent lives given the conditions of the time. They certainly were a lot better off than the peasantries or the serfs, and they had a reasonable life. But there was always potential for trouble, that's for sure. Once they became Zionists, then they have to, it's like for a Zionist, it's always 1938. It's like Netanyahu even said as much. Or, oh my God, here comes the Holocaust again. This is outrageous. And it's one thing that Jews have to get over, mind you. Yeah.
You mentioned this, you talked about some of the genocidal passages in the Old Testament.
Right.
In the Torah. One thing, it's a mystery to me. I mean, there are things where in Deuteronomy you talk about it, where you go kill every man, woman, and child. Right. God dictates that you go and wipe out the land for us.
Right.
That's what the Nazis did exactly. Yes. Why is that parallel never made?
It is made.
By whom?
But other people have made it. No.
Would you elaborate on that?
You can't read these first 5 books of Torah without being struck by, shall we say, a certain less than desirable moral attitude, which a certain nastiness about it. Yes, and it's some of its grandeur, some of its great poetry and great feats of the imagination. But I think what it is this peculiar effort to preserve a monotheistic God that means that you have to hold yourself above all other people. It's the covenant with Abraham.
Do you think the Nazis, in some way,
sure,
that influenced the Nazis?
Oh, sure.
Can you discuss that?
Well, I don't want to overstate it, but again, it's the state. Well, first of all, the Nazis were very, very, very given to wallowing in the mistreatment that they had received. When they went into Poland in 39 and 40, and just basically with extermination orders. That's another thing. The Holocaust is really, really, really horrible, but it was not just directed against the Jews. Okay? Because they did it against the Poles. Huge massacres of Poles, like anti-Zionist. And the point was, the Poles mistreated us so after World War I. Look how we have to. We're only paying them back, and not only paying them back, but we're seeing that they don't ever do to us again. And so on and so forth. They thought the Poles were this real menace. And so there was a deep, self-pitying, morose quality to Hitlerism, Nazi ideology that was particularly aggravating. They were badly, certainly, in my view, of course you never proved these things, but certainly in my view, had the Versailles Conference assigned blame equally for World War I, as they should have. There would not have been Hitler, nor a Holocaust.
Why aren't the Poles and other groups suffering as well known as the Jewish suffering in the Holocaust?
Well, because the Poles, first of all, it's within Poland, and the Poles have a real national history. The Jews don't have that national history, but so it's just to get you wherever you are, you know. And and Poles have an identity that, you know, comes from living in Poland, and the not the Jews, but the Zionists have to conquer a place in order to have a place to live. So they have that special need to postulate additional victimization over and above the actual victimization. And remember, it's not the Poles, the nationality that suffered by far the worst were the Russians. You know, by some estimates, I've read studies of this, 28 million Russians killed in the German invasion. Can you believe this?
Well, why is that not known then?
Oh, it certainly is known in Russia.
Well, I mean, in America.
But they don't go feeling sorry for themselves.
But here in America, say.
Well, because America is very chauvinist and doesn't take Russia seriously. I mean, the Russians, and one reason I'm thinking of the Russians is that they have a great sense of national pride and honor that they finally threw the German invaders out. But the Americans, you know, our country has a peculiar history, obviously, of twin crimes, you know, black slavery, but of course the extermination of the Indians. And I think whenever anybody else does that, we don't want to get involved making comparisons. But they warrant the same degree of comparison.
Well, this comes up a lot in discussions of the Holocaust. So I'm asking, was the Holocaust unique?
Yeah, but so is everything. There were features of the Holocaust that you never saw elsewhere. Namely, the industrialization aspect, the extreme degree of, you know, bureaucratic, you know, regulation, note keeping, the use of quote, advanced scientific methods, and the kind of a cold-blooded exterminist impulse. But, you know, the Black Holocaust, the Holocaust of the, you know, Africans who was also unique. I mean, they were put on ships, and they were deliberately, the ships were deliberately overstocked so that, because they knew about half of the people would die, and they threw them overboard. And, well, I guess a few victims of the Nazi Holocaust were thrown overboard, but that, you know, wasn't like a big thing. So every mass murder situation has its unique features. I definitely am very, very appalled, and I feel we must study the Holocaust because it's, and this has been said ungenerously but truly, that it's an instance of Europeans killing Europeans, and that was different. Take a little break.
What about Chabad? Can you you mentioned Chabad in the book, and you talk about Rabbi Schneerson and some of the racist things he said, whatever. Can you address Chabad? Do you know much about that?
No, I mean, but you're referring to the...
You recall Rabbi Mendel Schneerson, leader of said, quote...
About the DNA of the Jews?
Yeah, all that stuff.
Well, there's a whole panoply of movements and sects within Orthodox Judaism. I am not the leading scholar of this. There's a guy named Norton Mezvinsky. You might want to get a hold of him if you want to get the real lowdown on it. But there are different streams that enter into it, and some of them come out of the you know, the Hasidic movement, which is sort of ecstatic Judaism. It's against the kind of Torah or Talmud Judaism. But others are, you know, more bureaucratic, legalized, if you will. It's a large territory.
Okay.
But no, I'll just say a few things. I want to make one main point about it. I'm building towards it. I'll come right to it. There's a big range of views within that community. It's very unwise to reduce them all to the same. On the other, unfortunately, a very large number of them belong to sects or elements of the Zionist world that are extremely malignant and are gaining very much power in Israel, which is a shocking development when you recall that Zionism was a very secular movement that had no use for these people. But now these people are about eight children per family, and they're going up to about 10 to 12, 15% of the population. More and more of the secular Jews leave. These people are clearly wanting to take over. They were exempted from military service, but a lot of them undertake military service because they are infiltrating the IDF. This is a serious matter. That's one thing. The other thing is, it's very necessary to realize that among the most stout-hearted opponents of Zionism are groups of ultra-Orthodox Jews. Call them Neterai Karta, which is just that tendency. You probably met some of them. I don't know if you have.
I've heard of them.
Yeah, you should meet them. They're interesting. These I could never say these are my comrades because I just don't relate to that kind of religiosity. But I admire them for their principled opposition. I mean, these people will travel 1,000 miles for a demonstration, and they are really serious about it. And theologically, they're on pretty good ground, because their point is that you can't have a country until the Messiah shows up, and the Messiah isn't shown. I mean, the Christians feel that the Messiah was Jesus, but of course they don't accept that, and so by their lights, the whole Zionist thing is bogus.
When asked about Balaam, is it the separateness thing you quote?
Yeah, that's from
Numbers. Dwelling apart, not counting yourself among other nations. You quote that.
Yeah, that's just one. That's just one quote, and it comes out of my own imperfect grasp of the subject. Although I felt it was sufficiently paradigmatic to warrant being quoted there, because it gets back to one of the points I made earlier, that the paradigmatic contribution of the Jews to civilization, namely of the one God, Yahweh, everyone comes at the necessity of setting yourself off from other people. I don't think people fully enough appreciate that, the contradiction built into that. So that, the covenant between Abraham and Yahweh is one thing, but if you hold to that covenant, it's sort of a logic that follows from that, is that you don't share with anybody else. You got your own ways, and you think you're better than other people, and you're going to make them mad at you. Then you have to fight them and all, and you have to prevent them from infiltrating. You don't want your daughters to marry them, and so on and so on. And you're not going to share religious rituals, because there was within all early religions, within all of these proto-religious forms that have come before them, the great monotheistic, or the world religions, they're very syncretic. They mix and mingle and share stuff, but not the Jews. So that's the problem.
Could you discuss? You mentioned the Democratic Party, and you don't qualify. You talk about Jewish, the numbers, percentages that were Jewish and not Zionist or whatever. But could you discuss that kind of influence in the political world?
Well, it's enormous, and I probably have to stop here. This may be the last thing I can say, unless this is one or more question that you feel you have to get to me, because I feel my throat is getting so.
You're done?
No, I'll mention it. I'll talk, but I have to wind up on this. Am I looking sweaty? No, because I feel
so you feel okay?
I'm all right. It's just that it's hot with the woodness.
Okay. Well, I was sweaty.
Okay. No, I feel fine, actually, but I have to watch out because there'll be this other interview coming up.
Okay.
Both parties. It's equal opportunity as far as the Zionists. The way they want to make the political parties fear them and obey them. And they do that through the high degree of organization and the imposition of the ideological rules. After the attack on the Navi Mamara, where they killed 9 activists, they really see how AIPAC springs into action. I was following it very closely. They just they basically send out the notice and start collecting all of the the debts that they owe, and they watch you. And if you don't go along with them, you're in trouble. Probably, I haven't done this research, but I've read it. Probably about half the money that goes to Democratic Party candidates comes from Jewish sources, which is huge. It explains a whole lot about the American political process.
Okay.
I probably should find it.
All right.